On October 31st, 1979, 16-year-old Shirley Leadford was trying to get home from a Halloween party in the Sunland Tujunga neighborhood of the San Fernando Valley. Unable to secure a ride, she was forced to hitchhike, standing outside a gas station when she spotted a familiar face pulling up to the pumps. The man was Lawrence, whom Shirley knew as a frequent customer at the restaurant where she worked part-time as a waitress. As Lawrence stepped out of his van to pump gas, Shirley approached him, asking if he could give her a ride home. He readily agreed. However, when she opened the van's sliding door and climbed into the large, cavernous interior, she realized she was not alone. Lawrence was accompanied by a friend named Roy. Unbeknownst to Shirley, these two men and their van held secrets far darker than she could ever comprehend. She had just stepped into the route they were taking. Lawrence quickly assured her that he was simply avoiding heavy traffic. This explanation seemed plausible until he abruptly stopped the van and announced they had arrived at her destination. Looking out, Shirley didn't recognize the unfamiliar street. She turned to Roy, intending to ask for clarification on their location, only to see him brandish a knife. If she screamed, she was dead, he told her menacingly. Shirley instinctively looked to Lawrence. She knew him. He had always been kind. Surely he would possess the humanity to stop whatever horror Roy was threatening. But her hope instantly dissolved when she saw the truth. Lawrence was a willing participant. Remote San Gabriel Mountains. The roar of traffic on the highway below conveniently masking any sounds. Lawrence, seated in the rear of the van with her, removed the construction tape from Shirley's mouth, but not to free her. Instead, he began to torment her. He brutally beat, slapped, and mercilessly mocked her, repeatedly demanding that she say something. Lawrence's twisted desire was clear. He wanted to hear her beg, to express the overwhelming terror and helplessness she was feeling. He sought to soak up the agony of her suffering. When she failed to find words, he found her subsequent screams to be just as satisfying. He escalated the torment, using a claw hammer and a pair of pliers. Would drown out every sound. Lawrence eventually grew bored of the savage torture. He then took a wire coat hanger and placed it around Shirley's neck, using his pliers to tighten it. By this point, the 16-year-old was reportedly almost catatonic and barely reacted as the makeshift garrote grew tighter and tighter around her throat. Shirley Leadford died that Halloween night, her eyes open. As her body grew cold, Lawrence and Roy had to decide what to do with the corpse. Lawrence came up with a grotesque plan: to dump Shirley's body on the front lawn of a random family home. His perverse goal was to generate as much sensational media attention as possible. Roy agreed. Norris was the first of the pair to be arrested, though initially for a different charge. While in custody, police noticed how utterly terrified he appeared, and Roy quickly broke down, confessing everything. Though it was clear that Lawrence was the more dominant and driving force behind the murders, Roy admitted that they had been making a habit of driving around the Pacific Coast Highway, actively hunting for young girls to abduct. The body of Shirley Leadford, the only one police had found at that time, was confirmed to be their fifth and final victim. The two men, later infamously dubbed the Toolbox Killers, had been engaged in a terrifying murder spree all summer long, targeting young women and sexually assaulting the girls before eventually executing them by strangulation. The most condemning and haunting piece of evidence presented as he watched the jury's agonizing reaction. Even Prosecutor K, a hardened veteran, had to walk out at one point, later telling reporters that the tape had irrevocably affected the lives of everyone who heard it, leaving him haunted by the image of the girls' utter loneliness in their final moments. The defense attorney for Lawrence had attempted to get the audio tape banned from the court, questioning its necessity. However, Prosecutor K was emphatic, stating, "You're darn right, it should have been played. The jury needs to know what those guys did." At the conclusion of the trial, Roy Norris had already confessed to his crimes. He claimed the last he saw of her was when Roy drove her home, apparently via the San Gabriel Mountains. When confronted with the contents of the audio recording, Lawrence brazenly dismissed it as nothing more than evidence of a particularly boisterous lovemaking. But the jury easily saw through his sadistic lies. Lawrence was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous other charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, multiple sexual assaults, and unlawful possession of a firearm. The judge proceeded to sentence Lawrence to death, while Roy would be eligible for parole after serving 30 years of a 45-year sentence in an orphanage, where he was soon adopted by Mr. and Mrs. George Baker. Due to George's job in the aviation industry, the family relocated frequently across the United States. Lawrence, fully aware of his adopted status, found that this transient lifestyle worsened his psychological issues. By age 12, he already had a conviction for petty larceny in juvenile court. He later claimed his misbehavior was a desperate attempt to gain more attention and affection from his adoptive parents, who he felt neglected him. Expanded to include car theft and a hit and run. After serving about a year for these crimes, he was released, only to find his adopted parents had moved out of state without telling him. They had essentially disowned him. Lawrence would never see them again. After being abandoned by his adoptive parents, Lawrence plunged headfirst into a life of increasingly serious crime, spending the next several years cycling in and out of prison. While incarcerated on robbery charges, a prison psychiatrist was the first to flag Lawrence as possessing highly manipulative tendencies and considerable concealed hostility. A few years later, 2 independent psychiatrists further examined him, and both classified him as a borderline psychopath. He was prescribed antipsychotic medication, but shortly after his release, he was involved in a stabbing incident and was sent to the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. It was there, within the prison walls, that he met the man who would become his accomplice in terrorizing the young women. He was good or bad, so he might as well act solely in his own self-interest, ignoring the consequences. This destructive psychological impact likely contributed to his later series of assaults on women. Following his conviction for one of these assaults, he was sentenced to the California Men's Colony, the same prison where he met Lawrence Bitker. By the time Lawrence arrived, Roy was already connected with a group of hardened criminals. Roy later testified that Lawrence intervened to protect him on 2 separate occasions when other prisoners intended to cause him harm. This created a fast friendship. Fantasies involved an elaborate and chilling scheme. They planned to murder one girl for each teenage year from 13 through 19. Fixated on this horrifying blueprint, the pair agreed to put their plan into action immediately following their mutual release from prison. Following his conviction, Lawrence Bitker granted several interviews from his cell on California's death row. In one, he stated that the only remorse he felt was that he'd been caught. He even sometimes signed off replies to his fan mail with the chilling moniker, Pliers Bitker. Lawrence Bitker ultimately died of natural causes on December 13th, 2019, from the domination and torture of their victims. In interviews from prison, Roy Norris repeatedly attempted to deflect responsibility, claiming Lawrence forced him into the murders. He even claimed to have considered reporting their activities and actively tried to dissuade victims from entering their van, which they morbidly nicknamed the Murder Mac. He insisted, "I didn't enjoy killing," but then added, but that was Lawrence's favorite part, watching the women struggle to live, knowing he'd soon be taking life away. Than any other inmate on California's death row, and admitted that even years after the trial, he was haunted by recurring nightmares where he was always too late to prevent the girls from entering the van. Tragically, the case's chief investigator, Paul Binham, took his own life in December 1987. In his suicide note, Binham specifically referred to the murders committed by Bitker and Norris, stating they haunted him and expressing a fear that the men might hunt him down after being released. Raw training tool to desensitize new FBI agents to the shocking reality of torture and murder. When the courtroom originally heard those tapes, the sheer horror they produced cemented the Toolbox Murders as some of the most sickeningly disturbing crimes in American history. What is undeniably clear is that Lawrence Bitker knew exactly what he was doing when he chose Halloween night to hunt innocent young women. He understood that the date itself would compound their terror and intensify their misery. His act of recording the torture, a lasting memento of his sadism, affirmed his monstrous intent. He was not just a killer, he was a collector of agony. This terrifying story concludes the chilling account of the Toolbox Murders. don't forget to check out my main channel, Dark Whispers, where you can find longer compilations of interesting and scary stories, much like this one. Thanks again, friends, and I'll see you in the next one.